this fifth session of our group of lessons called How the Bible Came to Be here at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. If you have missed any of the previous lessons, you can see them online at either the church's Facebook page, which is live right this minute, I believe, as well as the church's YouTube page. Either one of those, you can view all of the previous lessons, as well as, I was told this morning, lots of previous lessons from years ago. But the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, despite our familiarity with the New Testament, especially the Gospels, there's much we do not know, and much we do not understand. Thank you always for opportunities to think about our faith. We want to appreciate better how your word invites us to live, how it encourages us to trust in your Son. At the same time, we admit how difficult it is to let go of deep-seated biases and fixed opinions, and even some long-held beliefs that are more comfortable than they are right. Some of Jesus' words inspire us. Some convict us. Some to remember we paint on the walls of our church. Some to forget we ignore. But God, continue to speak them, all of them, to us, for we know we need to hear them and to heed them. Amen. Well, if you haven't been following along with kind of where we're headed, I suppose that prayer might suggest that we're headed deep into the New Testament this morning. So those of you who have been just dying for this to happen, you can go, thank God. We have finally arrived there. Last week, I did for the New Testament the same thing I had done back in session 1 for the Old Testament, and that is to try to provide something of a context. Because often, I think, we tend to not put it in context. We don't know the context, and so I attempted to at least provide a little bit of that. And getting into the lesson this morning on the text of the New Testament, I'm going to continue with what I did last week, because there's really a whole lot more to the context we need to grasp moving into the New Testament. You may remember from last week that I suggested that the first century world, first century Roman world, was urban, it was sophisticated, it was connected, there were roads everywhere, and that it was a world and it was literate. Literacy was certainly not 19th century America, but it was probably much more than we think would have been possible in the first century, which is why the early church had such an easy time getting its literature out. It was because the world was so literate. But I want to move on from that and talk about some other things related to the first century world that the church grew up in. One of the big background pieces that I suspect we kind of think we know about this world is that the rulers, such as they were, the Seleucids right at the tail end of the Old Testament time, as well as the Romans, were evil oppressors that the people just had a hard time even surviving under, much less prospering under. And I want to suggest on the front end today that that's a bunch of hooey. There's just not a whole lot of truth about that whatsoever, and we need to drop it. We've got to move on and get to something a little bit closer to reality. One of the things that is often suggested about the Romans being so bad is that they taxed the people terribly. I mean, there were people starving everywhere. They were ready to rebel, and it was just a terrible way to live. And as I've suggested, that's just not true. Taxation in the United States is at least as bad, if not way worse, than it ever was in first century Judea. I'll let you chew on that for a minute. And if you look at our tax situation right this moment, where it's 10% on, if you're in the lowest tax bracket, and 35% or something like 37% if you're in the top tax brackets. We don't even really need to remember back to when some of us were kids, not all of us, but you know, your grandparents were kids. Uh, in the 40s, the lowest tax rate was over 20%, and the highest tax rate was over 90%. The entire time period of when we were born, us who are baby boomers, whether we are old baby boomers or young baby boomers, 20 to 90% was the tax rate in the United States. It's not until you get to Ronald Reagan when all of the tax codes begin to be dismantled that we have gotten to where we are today. But even with where we are today, and you're in the lowest tax bracket of 10%, in addition to that, you've got not only federal income tax, but you've got Medicare, and you've got Social Security tax, and you've got state tax, and you've got local tax. And then when you get beyond all of that, then you've got sales tax, which around here is 10%, give or take. And then you've got all of the other taxes that get added to the utilities, the recreation, and you name it, you name it, you name it. And never mind the fees that, I don't know what to call them other than some form of a tax. And then you add in the church side of it. Now, a tithe is a tenth. We may or may not tithe. When I grew up, when it came time for the passing of the plates, we were always told that it was time for tithes and offerings, because those are, in fact, two different things. For the most part today, we talk about taking up the offering, which, either on purpose or not, has sloughed off the tithe. But leaving that to the side, because this is New Testament, not contemporary. Tithe is 10%, and an offering is whatever over and above that, out of gratitude. You add all that together into the tax codes, assuming that we're giving a tithe and giving an offering, it's very possible that we're giving 50% of our money away on an annual basis. That's way more than anybody in Judea was paying. It just was not that way at all. There was not widespread starvation. There was not political executions going on. There was not suicidal depression among the people of Judea in the first century. It weren't all that bad, which is precisely why, I'm not going to say large portions of, but at least there is a movement among Gentiles, those who are around Jews, whether it's in Palestine itself or over in Egypt or Babylon or Greece or Rome. The Jews have so many benefits in first century Roman Empire that, apart from the fact that they may want to worship the one true God that the Jews do, they want in on all the benefits of being Jewish. Because the Jews didn't have to pay all the taxes that the rest of the Roman Empire had to pay. The Jews didn't have to engage in all kinds of activities that the rest of the Roman Empire had to. In the first century Roman Empire, nobody, except potentially the senatorial class and the equestrian class in Rome itself, nobody had it as good as the Jews. I'm not going to say that you and I would want to go back and live in first century Judea. Heck, most of us wouldn't want to go back and live in 1930 America. But all that to the side, I'm going to suggest incredibly strongly that we need to let go of thinking that first century Judea was just burdensome and it's amazing that anybody survived. It was not that way at all. The religious freedoms that the Jews had, nobody else in the empire was even close to that. The rest of the Roman Empire had to, among other things, worship the emperor. Because of Herod, that king that we think was so notoriously bad, because of Herod and his daddy, who were big pals with his dad, with Julius Caesar, himself with Augustus Caesar, so much so that in fact Herod's children, his sons, grew up in, not around or knew, they grew up in the household of Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar cared for Herod's sons. Because of their close connection, Herod obtained all kinds of benefits. There's tax benefits and all those other benefits I've alluded to, but including religious benefits. Jews didn't have to worship Caesar. They prayed for Caesar. They did not pray to Caesar. Now, there's nothing wrong with praying for your governmental leader. I'd suggest that we all need to be doing that, whether you like the poor wretch or not. You and I always, at any time, need to be praying for others. We don't pray against others. We pray for them. That's part of our role as the priests that we are. Have I made my point? There's a lot more that could be said for that. We can spend the whole day on that, but I'll move on. Again, it matters of kind of wide context. If somebody were to ask you out of the blue, how long was Jesus' ministry? You know, between his baptism and his death. How long was he ministering in Judea and Galilee?
3 years.
3 years is the typical answer that is always given. If you then were asked the question, well, how do you know that?
Someone told me.
Someone told you is exactly the answer. And if they followed that up with the question of, well, can you show me how you or they got that? Probably the vast majority of us in this room would very quickly realize, I'm not going to say a word because I don't have a clue where that idea of a 3-year ministry came from. So I'm going to tell you. So you can answer that question. If you're reading through Matthew and Mark and Luke, because in fact there isn't any other ancient documents that tell us about the life of Jesus. It's the Gospels. Now the Gospels are not biographies of Jesus, but it's only in the Gospels that we learn about Jesus' life. There's nothing else to look at. So each one of you seated right here, right now, are as privy to the documents as any reputed scholar who has ever lived or ever shall live. You've got the documents. If you read through Matthew, Mark, or Luke, with the question in mind, how long was Jesus in ministry? You would get to the end of Luke and go, well, I don't see how in the world we got 3 years out of that. I don't see how it was 1 year. It was a few months, maybe. That's it. If you don't believe me, read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's no 3-year ministry there. So where'd it come from? There's only one gospel left, the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John does not say Jesus was in a 3-year ministry. But John cuts back and forth between Jesus being in Jerusalem and not in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem and not in Jerusalem. And if you and I just read the book of John as if it is a day-by-day chronicle of Jesus' life, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, none of the Gospels are that. They're not biographies. They don't intend to be day-by-day chronicles. But if we read it that way, this in Jerusalem, out of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, out of Jerusalem, makes it look as if there were 3 trips to Jerusalem. That there are 3 Passovers that Jesus goes to. Well, I don't care if we're mainline liberal Protestants or fundamentalists, when it comes to this sort of stuff, every single one of us are literalists when it comes to reading. That's the only thing we know to do. Well, it says that there's 3 Passovers. That's how we get a 3-year ministry for Jesus. I'll come back to that when we get to the Gospel of John this morning. Was Christianity a rural movement or was it an urban movement? Most of us, if we weren't asked that question by somebody who was going to be poking holes in stuff this morning, would probably say, well, it was a rural movement. And that too would be absolutely wrong. It is a fully urban movement. And even when, during Jesus' own time of ministry, a few months or 3 years, whatever it was, yes, he's wandering around in Galilee and in Judea, kind of in the hinterlands, so we could say that's rural. But even then, somebody's paying for the food that Jesus and all his disciples are eating. That's coming from somewhere. There are these wealthy women who are supporting Jesus' ministry during all that time. I'm not going to say any more about that. But it starts in this urban situation, and once you get to Paul, it expands exponentially in that direction. Paul visits, talks to churches in, establishes churches in, receives letters from the biggest urban centers in the entire Roman Empire. If you transpose this onto America, the church is being planted by Paul and other early Christians in New York City, D.C., Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Little Rock and Rogers and Springdale don't cut it. It's the huge urban centers, with the idea being that once established there, over the next generation, it will begin to do this into the towns and villages surrounding the metropolises of the day. And they were metropolises. Ephesus. Estimates are it was somewhere between 250 to 400,000 people. Alexandria, Egypt, not that they started a church there, but Alexandria, Egypt, 1 million plus people. And on and on and on. Huge urban centers is where the church gets established and then moves on from there. The book of Revelation is, for all intents and purposes, written to 7 churches in the western edge of Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. Those 7 urban centers are where the majority of the population in Asia Minor is located. Ephesus and Smyrna and Thyatira and Pergamum, and then coming in through the interior to Philadelphia and ultimately to Laodicea. That's where it's established, and it's from there that it moves on beyond. Okay, let's come back to Herod for a moment, that evil king that tried to kill Jesus when he was a boy. Do you realize there was no architect in the 1st century Roman Empire who was more impressive than King Herod?
Yeah.
He was the premier architect in the entire Roman Empire. Nobody else was building the buildings, temples, monumental buildings, palaces, secluded getaways that Herod was. People from all over the Roman Empire wanted him to come and build their buildings. And it wasn't just the big, impressive things you could see. It was also aqueducts and sewer systems, infrastructure. The guy was prolific. The guy was incredibly genius when it came to that sort of thing. That's King Herod. I've already mentioned to you that he's the one responsible for many of these benefits that come to the Jews, that they all enjoy. Now granted, he was pretty terrible to his own family. In fact, his good buddy who raised his own sons, Augustus Caesar, said it was much easier being a dog in Herod's household than it was his son. And he was right about that, because Herod ends up, toward the end of his life, killing most of his sons because he was paranoid and thought they were trying to take over his kingdom. He didn't kill his pet dogs, but he did kill his sons. So that much certainly was true about Herod. But the man was a genius who lived in a time when it was easy enough for folks to rebel, if you will, for whatever reasons, and try to kill a king or somebody who was in charge. And that scared the bejeebers out of him. And that's where then that whole story at the beginning of the Gospels comes into play, where these magi come telling him about a new king. So let's turn our, yeah,
This is the son of Herod the Great?
it is Herod the Great.
It is Herod.
Herod the Great's sons, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons will continue to rule, not nonstop. They will continue to rule, at least in portions of, if not over the entirety of, Judea and Galilee and the Decapolis and other portions of that for more than 100 years, all the way up to 93 AD. Somebody in Herod's household is a king or a tetrarch or another kind of ruler in the territory. So let's talk for just a moment about the temple. He actually built the temple in 2 years to flush out or to fill out the rest of those almost 40 acres, as well as all the other monumental buildings that compose the entirety of the temple complex. That kind of building went on for more than 80 years. But the temple itself, the temple building itself, 2 years to build that. There was not another building in the entire Roman Empire that was as big as the Temple of the Jews in Jerusalem, except for the pyramids in Egypt. Rome had nothing to compare to Herod's temple. Now, if I stopped right there, that would suggest enough for you to go, oh, so maybe that's why Rome wanted the temple destroyed. And if you think that, in part, you would be absolutely correct. And in fact, portions of that temple get taken to Rome. And one of the buildings that is constructed within a decade of the demise of Herod's temple is a building that you and I all know, the Colosseum. Herod's temple, the facade to that temple was 150 feet tall, 15 stories. This is not even first century. That temple's built essentially 20 years BC. 150 feet tall, the temple's facade was. To the side, how tall is the Colosseum? 156 feet. Not only was Herod's temple 150 feet tall, the facade, I mean not the entirety of the temple, but the facade in front of it, it was seated on temple grounds that were, by the time it was all completed, it's 100 feet up in the air. It's 100 feet above the roads, the streets in Jerusalem. So if you're on the streets of Jerusalem looking up, it's effectively 250 feet tall. There's not a building in Rogers or Springdale or Bentonville or Fayetteville that comes close to that. There is a building or two in Little Rock, but that's about it in our beloved state of Arkansas that bypasses what was in first century Jerusalem. Somebody asked me last week, well, explain the difference between temples and synagogues. There's one temple and only one temple. There are synagogues all over. The temple was where you went to give offerings and sacrifices, to be able to enjoy the benefits of all of that. That's where the temple tax, your tithe, went to, where it was stored. Synagogues were where you went to study Scripture, to engage in what we're doing right now. Synagogues were everywhere. In fact, not only were they everywhere, you see them within the book of Acts being referenced. They're not just in Palestine. They're throughout the Roman Empire. Here's this verse early on in the book of Acts. I mean, we're not talking but just 3-4 years, if that, after Jesus' death. And it makes a reference to the synagogue of the freedmen, former slaves, now freed, in Cyrene, or Cyrena. That's present-day Libya. If Alexandria, Egypt, is the Nile Delta, keep going west until you get into to Libya, and there's Cyrene. Alexandria is the Nile Delta. The provinces of Cilicia, if you were a Latin in the first century, you would say Cilicia. But Cilicia, that's Turkey. And Asia, meaning Asia Minor, the entirety of Turkey. Cilicia is sort of the southern edge. In fact, Tarsus is in Cilicia. So this isn't referring to a synagogue. This is referring to synagogues all over the Roman Empire that are struggling to interact with each other and appreciate what each other is saying. Don't need to say any more about that, other than just to point out that even within the pages of the New Testament, you begin to see that there are synagogues all over. Estimates are there were somewhere between 400 and 500 synagogues in Judea and Galilee in the first century alone. One temple, synagogues proliferating everywhere. You could have a synagogue if you could get 10 males together to create a minyan. I'll come back to that in just a bit. A minyan is the least amount of people, least amount of Jews to come together so that they could have a prayer service. All right. Resurrection. Well, Christians believe that. Did the Jews? The vast majority of them, the answer would be yes, not no. For all intents and purposes, the only Jews in the first century who did not believe in resurrection were the Sadducees. And those of you who were here last week, I think it was, in which I said there were maybe 50 or 100 Sadducees, period. I'm willing to say that's, for all intents and purposes, the entirety of Jews living in first century, because it was just the Sadducees who didn't believe in resurrection. What ultimately makes a huge difference between Jews and Christians, first century and beyond, is who has been or who has not been resurrected. Not whether there is or is not resurrection. Okay, one kind of background thing. Could have done this in Old Testament times, but this works perfectly well here. Those 10 lost tribes of Israel that Great Britain made such a big deal of to establish their own lords in England, and that America ends up picking up on and talks about the Indians and others in what becomes the United States. That's a bunch of nonsense. But 10 lost tribes. Well, Assyria did cart away lots of Israelites, the same way that 150 years later the Babylonians will cart away lots of Judahites. Assyria carts them away to Assyria and other places and leaves them. Babylonians carts them away primarily just to Babylonia. The Judahites come back, so those two tribes aren't lost. But the Israelites supposedly never come back. And so they are just thought to be lost. It's a typical way of talking, that there are no Israelites after Assyria gets rid of them. But here's the deal. Assyria only took the cream of the crop. The same way that the Babylonians only took the cream of the crop. Most of us, dumb as dirt and not worth much, we got left behind. And one of us. There are major parts of America that doesn't want the poor and the needy and the huddling masses to come here. Now, Assyria and Babylon didn't want them then. They only wanted the scientists and the literate scribes and others who could add something to their culture. Well, okay. So, tribes are lost. Except there you are in the middle of the New Testament, reading the book of Luke, and that story that we were just in a couple of dadgum weeks ago, where there's a guy named Simeon and an old shrew-ish lady named Anna, and doggone it, it tells us right in the middle of it that she's of the tribe of Asher. This is 750 years after the tribes got lost. Asher's an Israelite tribe. Asher is up where Tyre and Sidon are, north of Galilee, north of the Sea of Galilee on the Mediterranean coast. That's the tribe of Asher. So maybe there were 10 lost tribes, but there was still one old lady hanging around that remembered where she came from. Incidentally, as nearly as we can sort of put things together, as late as 1st century, most people could pretty well plot their genealogy. If you're Jewish, you could pretty well plot your genealogies backwards. Who knows how far back? Lots of those records were at the temple. That's part of what gets destroyed when the temple gets destroyed, along with lots of tax records and other stuff. It wasn't just Rome that destroys the temple and the stuff in it. I won't say any more about that at all. And one last sort of background kind of issue here. Jesus' glory. Well, what was Jesus' glory? Well, you know, his divinity, his miracles, the fact that there were these large crowds that were around, his resurrection. We could fill in lots of things. And I'm not going to say that's not so. But at least within the Gospel of John, that is not what is said to be Jesus' glory. What is said to be Jesus' glory in the Gospel of John? It is his crucifixion. That is there's nothing that points to Jesus' relationship to God any more clearly to the 1st century church than his death, his suffering. There's Jesus talking about it himself. Chapter 12. And there he is at the bottom in Gethsemane, making it even more clear what he's suggesting in chapter 12. It's his death that he sees as his glory. one little pastoral comment here, and then I'm going to move on. Godly lives don't necessarily reward us with upward mobileness. Godly lives may, if they truly are making us more and more like this man, may engage us a whole bunch in downward mobility in life. Okay, let's get to the New Testament. I've already suggested that the Gospels themselves are not biographies. Never were intended to be biographies. They don't start necessarily with Jesus' birth and wind us all the way through to his death. They do that. At least two of them do. But you can't read the Gospels as if what takes place in chapter 6 necessarily follows what takes place in chapter 5. It may, but it may not. That's not the point. They are doing the same thing that the writers of the Gospels were doing then, the same thing that clergy do today when they preach. They're focusing upon a point, a theological point they want to make. And then they sort of make a big to-do about that. They tell a story around that point. Each one of the Gospels has a specific point it's really trying to make about our Lord and Savior. And it does that from beginning to end. I'll say more about that in just a little bit. But that's why the Gospels are in some ways very different from each other. They're not any different than if you get 10 clergy together preaching a sermon on the same passage of Scripture, you're going to wonder, are they even reading the same passage of Scripture? It has nothing to do with each other, unless they got their sermon out of a sermon book or some cheap online source that gives them a sermon. They often don't have anything to do with each other. Well, okay, our Gospels are the same way. They're telling us the story, but the point that they're making varies from person to person. The Gospels make up more than 70% of the New Testament. There are, in terms of just sheer numbers, 70% of the New Testament are the epistles, the letters. There are 21 letters out of, well, it's actually even more than that, 21 letters out of 27 books, but those four Gospels, in terms of amount of words and space, they take up more than 70% of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are kind of similar. In fact, they're very similar to each other. John kind of stands out like a sore thumb. It's not like those other ones. Matthew was probably written to a Jewish audience. Mark and Luke and John are probably written to more of a Gentile audience. That shows up in things like Matthew, for instance, he talks the way Jews talk. Well, he is a Jew, and he's writing to Jews. He doesn't explain phrases that Jews use, whereas Mark, writing to a Gentile audience, will very quickly say things like, Jesus called James and John sons of Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, because the audience that he was writing to, they didn't know Aramaic or Hebrew. So he has to explain it. Jesus is crucified in the Gospel of Mark on Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And on and on and on and on. Matthew doesn't care about that, because he knows the people he's writing to know what that is. Jews didn't pronounce the name of God. They substituted Adonai, Lord, in its place, or some other roundabout phrase. So when Jesus tells parables in the Gospel of Matthew, he talks about the kingdom of heaven is like, fill in the blank. Mark, Luke, the kingdom of God. Because the Gentiles didn't have that thing about saying the word of God. The kingdom of God is like, fill in the blank. And on and on. So why do you write the Gospels? Well, lots of the eyewitnesses are starting to die. You need to get it down so that what we know isn't forgotten, to document what was going on in the life of Jesus. By the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, for all intents and purposes, the Gospels are completely canonized. Yeah, I know there's no canon yet officially for the church that early, but there are 4 Gospels. There are not 2. There are not 6. There are 4, and it's the ones we know. And they, alongside Paul's letters, as well as many of the other letters, are all pretty well in place by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century. So within 50 years of the last of the New Testament being written, the New Testament's pretty much in place. There's some differences that continue to occur over the next couple centuries, but for all intents and purposes, it's settled by 150. Which is not to say that the text itself doesn't change some. That prayer that we pray every week, the Lord's Prayer. That last phrase, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. As nearly as we can tell, Jesus didn't say that. It doesn't show up in any early manuscripts. It begins showing up in manuscripts that are 4th century and beyond. Which is why, if you have a contemporary translation, New Revised Standard Version, NIV, whatever, you'll get to Matthew 6 and start reading it, and you'll go, well, where's the rest of it? It's not even there. Because as nearly as we can tell, it's not there. It's a later addition. The ending to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. That's more than just a phrase. So it's in our Bibles, but it's in italics, and it's set apart from the text, and we're told this isn't part of Mark. We don't know how it got here, and it was here a lot, but it wasn't in the early manuscripts of Mark. Or in John. That strange story that seems to just break the account at the end of John chapter 7, and then you get back to the story halfway through chapter 8, but right there at the beginning of, at the end of chapter 7 and through the first several verses of chapter 8, there's this story of a woman taken in adultery. You know the story. That's now in italics in our Bibles. It's set apart. It wasn't in the early versions of John. In fact, there are early manuscripts in which it's not even in John, period. It's in the book of Luke. It's in Luke chapter 21. And if you stick it in Luke 21, you'll go, oh, it makes perfect sense there. So I'm not saying it didn't happen, just saying John didn't have it. How it migrated from Luke to John is beyond anything I don't know. Nobody knows. But it is nevertheless the case. Okay. How to hit that many things. Matthew. I told you last week that the order of the Gospels is the order in which the early church thought they were written. Matthew, they thought, was the earliest written Gospel. It was also the most used and the most widely spread of all the Gospels through most of the years of the church. It's only been in the last couple of centuries that that has ceased to be the case. But if we lived 1750 or before, Matthew was the beloved Gospel. Matthew was the one everybody turned to. Well, it has all kinds of wonderful things to talk about in there. Jesus is the new Moses, for instance. Herod, like Pharaoh, tries to kill him. The Holy Family escapes down to Egypt as opposed to getting out of Egypt. There's 40 days in the wilderness as opposed to 40 years in the wilderness. There's a new law that is pronounced on the mountaintop, the Sermon on the Mount. There's an exodus that occurs there's a crucifixion. There's all these exodus motifs that are occurring throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And there's that flight over to Egypt. When the Holy Family leaves Judea to try to escape Herod, and do escape Herod, it's not like they just ran over somewhere in Egypt. I've already mentioned time after time after time that there's 2 entire wards out of 5 in Alexandria, Egypt, that are Jewish. If you're Jewish and trying to get away from something in Judea, where the heck would you go in Egypt? You'd skirt right along the Mediterranean Sea over to where the Jews are, in Alexandria. That's probably where they went. They spoke the language. They had the newspapers they could read, so they'd know when Herod kicks the bucket, and they can go on and on and on. Jesus is portrayed as a very good Jew all the way through Matthew. For instance, when he heals somebody, he says, "Go show yourselves to the priest," because it was the priest alone who could say, "You are clean." It couldn't be a lay person like Jesus. He engages in temple worship. He participates regularly in synagogue. He goes on festivals, pilgrimage festivals to Jerusalem, like Passover. And he dresses like a Jew. When he heals that woman who has the hemorrhages, she reaches out to touch the hem of his garment, the fringe of his garment. Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, doesn't say the hem or the fringe of his robe. She grabbed onto the prayer knots that were at the 4 edges of his garment. That's what she grabs onto. What here is translated as fringe. Tzitzit, that are on, even to this day, on Jewish clothing. The Gospel of Matthew is a teaching gospel, which is probably one of the reasons it was used so much by the church. It groups things together to make it easy to memorize, or to remember if you're not good at memorizing. So there's all those teachings that are put together to create the Sermon on the Mount in 5 through 7. Or all the miracles are put together, or all the parables are put together, or all the woes pronounced on the Pharisees. They're all put together so you can count them off on your fingers and remember all of them as you try to talk about them. Parables. These are children's versions of important things. Parables aren't easily understood stories that you tell to people who aren't necessarily bright so that they can get it. Parables, in fact, hide the truth. They don't reveal the truth, they hide it so that you don't get it. Teachers do that, because there's some truths that are tough to hear. But if you tell a story, that'll engage people, and they'll keep listening, and you get to the end, and they may or may not be pleased, but they at least listen to it all the way, and then they chew on it for a while, and for a longer while, and for a longer while, and then doggone it, they got it. But on the front end, it's a story. It kind of hides the truth. Hide not in the sense of making sure you can't understand it, but just kind of wrapping it up in a bunch of other stuff so that it can sit there and fester in a person so that it can really come to fruition. Gospel of Mark. This was the most neglected gospel all the way up until this century. In fact, beginning in about the 1920s is when this gospel kind of came into its own. No need to go into more about that, but for most of its existence, it has been thought to be nothing more than a Reader's Digest version of Matthew. Today, most of the folks in universities talk about it very differently. Mark is very frank about the failures of the disciples, the lack of success that Jesus had, the villages not caring, that even in which those that Jesus grew up in, not liking what he said. Even his own family thinks that he's gone bonkers, says he needs to come on home and stop this nonsense. And the temptations. You know, if you read Matthew and Luke, there's these three stylized temptations that happen out in the wilderness. The devil's there, and, you know, stones into bread and jumping off the facade of the temple, or at least the temple mount, and bowing down and worshiping me. If you're reading in the Gospel of Mark, here's what, that's not what I want you to see. Where am I? Well, I've already mentioned this, so you don't need to see that anyway. I'll come back to that one. That's all you see about the temptations in the Gospel of Mark. You see why it's easy to say, well, that's just a digest of Matthew. But if you continue to read closely in the Gospel of Mark, a strange thing happens. You discover that Jesus leaves his disciples on 3 occasions and finds a place of privacy, and he prays. He doesn't do it twice. He doesn't do it 6 times. He doesn't do it 4. He does it 3 times. And each one of those 3 times that Jesus goes off by himself, folks are wanting to know where he went. First time is right after he heals Peter's mother-in-law. Second time is during the feeding of the 5,000 when they want to make him king. The third time is in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's not really sure that he wants to drink this cup down fully. I can read each one of those events that occurs just prior to the prayer as a time of terrible temptation to take the easy way. Mark's got the 3 temptations, not there, but throughout the Gospel of Mark. Man, if that's not true to life, we don't get to a week or 2 after we get baptized, deal with temptation, and we're done with it. It goes on through the entirety of our life, right up to the point we die. Let's go back to this one for a moment. At the point of his death, almost. This is another example of Mark telling you what Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And this has erupted into all kinds of tales as to, well, was Jesus losing faith? Was he not losing faith? What's going on? Why would he be quoting this? Jews quoted the first lines of a psalm the same way you and I quote the first line of a song or the first line of whatever, with the intention being that whoever we're talking to knows the song or whatever and can fill in the rest of the details. Most likely, Jesus doesn't just say, my God, why have you forsaken me? He begins to quote Psalm 22. If you start reading Psalm 22, you will begin thinking, somebody had to have written this after Jesus' crucifixion, which would not be true. It had been around for centuries. oh man, is it specific to what Jesus is facing. At a time like this, I feel abandoned. But by the time you get to the end of Psalm 22, the psalmist, the reader, you and me, Jesus on the cross, gives himself, herself fully into the hands of God, knowing that God has me. And I am safe in the arms of God. It is a majestic statement Jesus is making on the cross. Even in this death moment, I am God's and he is mine. It is an incredible statement by our Lord on the cross. Gospel of Luke, longest book in the New Testament, focuses on all the people the other Gospels don't focus on. Women and poor people and social outcasts and others, which is why it's so much fun to read in some ways. But it also has a story toward the end of the Gospel when Jesus comes into Jerusalem that we like to refer to as the triumphal entry. We make a big deal out. He had a terrible, things are always going wrong for Jesus, especially the second half of his ministry after the transfiguration. But by golly, he gets to Jerusalem and it's all good for at least a couple days. Well, not so fast. This one who was humble, who didn't draw attention to himself, why on earth would we think that suddenly he begins doing so at the tail end of his life? He dies like he lives. He dies as he is born. Not a big deal. But beyond that, those Pharisees and the others who are cheering and so forth and so on the roads coming into Jerusalem, it's not like they were standing there waiting for Jesus to arrive, and suddenly as Jesus rounds the corner, they start jumping up and going, hey! And then as soon as he's gone, they stop. They're doing that for everybody. They're cheering on all of the rabbis coming into Jerusalem with their disciples. They're cheering on all the pilgrims coming into Jerusalem, including Jesus. But our gospel story isn't about all those others. It's only about Jesus. If we forget that, we think it's only about Jesus, as opposed to just what goes on. The same way that a city gets ready for a Super Bowl or for the president coming to town, there's all kinds of preparation to get things ready. Those who are important figures in Jerusalem are getting things ready so that the pilgrims coming in know what to do and what not to do at time of Passover. And then there's the Gospel of John. First half of the book of John is about signs. Second half is about Jesus' passion. And we're told that that's the case. First of signs. And that's referred to over and over. There's the 7 signs that are shown in the Gospel of John. A sign, a semeion, is an event that occurs in this instance in the life of Jesus, that for a person who's paying attention, you see that happen and you suddenly go, whoa. There's more to this person than just what appears on the surface. It's telling us something about God. Turning water into wine. Healings, feeding, resuscitating. Somebody who's paying attention, this is revealing God in his life. Which is why these stories and others like them take place all during this season after Epiphany. In addition to these, we could talk about Jesus' baptism. And all the other stories, including the one that we're going to read this morning, they are signs revealing Jesus to be more than just some guy walking around who's kind of smart. This is God. walking around in our midst. There's also I am statements, and you see those. Don't have time to go into all that this morning. Give me about another 90 seconds to get through John here. John tells us, unlike the other gospel writers necessarily, John tells us why he wrote his gospel and why he wrote it the way he did. And there's the rationale he gives. Why does John's look different than the others? Well, John has a different purpose. Here was his purpose. I wrote these things so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. He'd already told you that. Way back at the very beginning of the gospel, he had John pointing out Jesus and saying that very thing. And once again, to get into John 2, there's that first sign, turning water into wine. And you say, well, how does turning water into wine tell me something about Jesus? Well, as somebody whose Bible is the Old Testament, you would very well know that there is this line at the tail end of the book of Amos, the prophet, in which he's talking about when the day of the Lord appears in our midst, it is going to revolutionize everything. Life is going to be very, very different. In fact, the one who's reaping, if using a nice little farming analogy here, the one who's reaping, he overtakes the guy who's planting. He doesn't any more than plant the seed than it's time to reap. Well, that's just not true if you're a farmer. But in this new world, in the day of the Lord, it is. You barely get the seed in the ground and it's already producing. Or use another analogy. New wine starts dripping from the mountains and flowing from the hills. It turns water into wine. There it is. It's just some strange, silly story. Unless your eyes get open and you see that it is truly a sign, it tells you something. Jesus is introducing the day of the Lord and bringing it into reality right here among us. Oh, there's a whole lot more to tell, but I'm already past time. I've got to stop. Cleansing of the temple courtyard. It's not showing Jesus' anger, really, but here's the temple courtyards. It's not in the temple building. This is the area where the Gentiles could be. But Jesus shows up and getting ready for Passover, there's not room for Gentiles in here. It's all filled with money changers. And getting ready for Passover, there are times the church can become so ingrown and looking at itself that there's not room for outsiders. That's what's got Jesus irritated, not the changing of money. It's that the very place that should be open for others to be able to come to faith is closed off because we got to take care of our own stuff. We got to get ready for the supper or the lunch or the potluck or whatever it is that we're doing, as opposed to sharing the gospel with those around us. Okay, this is the fun group of books we get to look at. Next week we're going to spend some time looking at Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, and then spend some time looking at manuscripts the week after that. And there's a couple things I'll probably come back to a little bit later in the New Testament, share them next week since we didn't get to them today. Thanks for being here.